Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor, Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
And WPR associate editor, Prachi Vidwans. Hi, Prachi.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about the border clash this week between Indian and Chinese forces, which left at least 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers dead. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Mira Rapp Hooper about her new book, Shields of the Republic, The Triumph and Peril of America's Alliances, on the state of U.S. alliances and how to improve them. Prachi, Freddy, getting to this week's topic, just for some background for any of our listeners who aren't aware, there was this border clash in the Himalayan mountains, a very remote region where there's no actual inhabitants, no real accessible resources, no real reason to be worried about the place, to sum it up. And yet there's this border presence of Indian and Chinese troops, and they've actually prohibited the use of firearms at this border area in order to try to prevent unnecessary conflict from escalating or conflict from escalating unnecessarily, which has resulted in the tendency for these troops to face off and get into major brawls, including rock throwing and beating each other with homemade clubs and things of that nature. Pretty brutal stuff. Over the course of the last few months, the Chinese have crossed actually a border that is not formally agreed upon by the two sides, but have crossed the recognized line of control and into the Indian side, and there's been all these sorts of skirmishes. And this week, in an effort to de-escalate, things went awry, and there was another major brawl. Started out with reports of 3 deaths, which was already something because it's the first deaths on the border since in 45 years. And now, just in the last few days, reports came out that it was actually more along the lines of 20 deaths on the Indian side, an unknown number of Chinese soldiers dead, although the Chinese foreign ministry did confirm that there were deaths. So Prachi, it's this recurring tension on the border at the same time that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese leader Xi Jinping have repeatedly had summits where they patched things up, played friends, were very amicable without necessarily addressing the underlying issues.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's, this skirmish just happened. It's a bit too soon to know for sure what it's going to mean, but some of the responses to the flare-up have been, quite dramatic in the sense that some are saying that they believe, Sino-Indian relations can never go back to the old normal, which is what Ashley Tellis from Carnegie said on Twitter earlier this week. It's hard to know. I mean, there is a big contrast between the violence of this clash, which led to some of the first casualties in quite a long time at this border, and the discussions between Xi and Modi, who, as you said, have tried to maintain pretty good relations. Even earlier this month, after a smaller flare-up that involved some rock throwing, the two nations discussed actively trying to reduce tensions at this border and had agreed to respect the border, create some more buffer space, and yet just weeks later this happened. So there's definitely a tension here. I think it reflects some of the difficulties of balancing the need to cooperate and the need also to compete between China and India. They have a great need to cooperate on economic issues. China, for example, has been trying to help India set up its 5G technology, or is interested in doing so. Whereas there are also definitely reasons that they feel a need to compete now. So, for example, China has been reaching out to increase its influence in countries that border India through its Belt and Road Initiative and through diplomacy, and this has really increased pressure on India to feel the need to balance back. And it kind of brings to mind the fact that both of them have different visions for Asia's future. I still think that all these reasons to cooperate still exist. So I'm a bit skeptical to think that this is going to lead to a much broader, more violent conflict, but it definitely presents a lot of interesting questions about where this relationship is going in the future.
Freddy, when you talk about going back to normal or even a new normal, for all the reasons that Prachi just described, it's kind of hard to come up with a definitive characterization of what normal is. There, depending on the most recent incident, whether it's driving tensions or reconciliation, it's a very complicated relationship that has to balance all of these competing trends and urgencies, both international and domestic, including the increasingly nationalist constituency at home that both leaders now have to deal with. So in a sense, getting to normal already is a pretty vague objective or horizon, given how complicated the relationship is.
Yeah, and also given how complicated this long-standing border situation is. India and China fought a brief war in 1962. It lasted about a month over this very issue, and they have sort of had this unresolved situation ever since, involving the line of actual control, as it's called, that you were referring to, this de facto border, but then there's other places along their remote Himalayan border where there have been previous tensions and standoffs. And it's sort of simmered, and then it's sort of this odd situation where tensions flare up, and then there's harsh words, but then they usually back down. In the last few years, when there were previous instances, including another standoff elsewhere in the Himalayas that lasted the better part of 2 months, I believe, that also brought risks of, is this going to be a military confrontation? Modi and Xi held, 2 summits after that. And the view really was, that there's this mutual interest in sort of guarding the status quo, even if there is this longstanding, unresolved border conflict. I think when you have 20 soldiers dying for the first time in 45 years, that, raises the question of, is that going to change the calculus? Can the tensions maybe not dissipate so easily? And then I think the added concern is what you're mentioning, that on the one hand, you have a leader in Modi who is a Hindu nationalist who has really done a lot of other things, including most of all in Kashmir last year, to change the status quo unilaterally and to really try to feed a strictly Hindu nationalist base, which is also fed in turn by an increasingly sort of jingoistic media in India that has also whipped up tensions with Pakistan last year. And then, obviously on the Chinese side, we've talked earlier about all the different ways that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi has taken on far more aggressive positions, whether that's in Hong Kong or against Taiwan or in the South China Sea. And I think for India, they look at their own neighborhood and they wonder, does Xi sort of have similar designs for South Asia? And I think that, there's been indications that given China's, growing economic clout in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh just over the border, that India has its guard up already because of that. And so, on top of this longstanding and almost never resolved border issue, it just sort of seems like a potent cocktail. And you do wonder if all of these things are making things more destabilized. I still come back to the fact that, the fact that this has gone on for so long and has remained unresolved for so long, and kind of with this song and dance of summits and standoffs, that you wonder if it's just going to kind of continue down that road.
There's this broader relationship that's complicated and has as many reasons for compromise and reconciliation as for standoff and tension. And then when you drill down into the sort of the logic of escalation here, it also is really complicated. You mentioned the Kashmir and India changing the facts on the ground there. A lot of this standoff here is a reaction on both sides to this idea that the other side is trying to change the facts on the ground. China had built up some infrastructure and roads and I believe brought some more military equipment to their side of the border. India responded by trying to build up some roads on its side so that they could supply the area more easily, as well as supply an air base there. And so that, I've read, led to the Chinese being more provocative and crossing the border to try to prevent that from happening, or the line of control. And in Kashmir, that what happened last year was a response to these incidents where Modi had been accused of kind of going soft on attacks against Indian troops in Kashmir by Kashmiri militants that are often portrayed in India and sometimes are either Pakistani proxies or Pakistani organizations. And so that there was this tit-for-tat exchange with Pakistan that didn't really end that well for India. They had a fighter jet shot down by the Pakistanis. The pilot was kept prisoner for a few days and then returned. So I think that for India, there's a real risk that Modi doesn't really want to. He's been accused of covering up these past incidents with China, of being soft there, similar to what the accusations were of him in Kashmir, and yet. You have to wonder how equipped the Indian Air Force is and the Indian military is to fight in this very remote region, given the outcome with Pakistan last year. And for China, for its part, I would imagine a stronger position militarily, although the truth is that the Chinese military has not ever really been tested, the modern military. And there's also a perception issue for China in the sense of right now, especially, there's a lot of apprehension about what kind of global power China will be, especially in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. So for China and for Xi, he wants to project strength and power and not back down either. But at the same time, all those concerns, Freddy, that you mentioned in terms of India being worried about China, they're not restricted to India. They're not exclusive to India. I think the whole region is looking and saying to itself, well, what kind of power is China going to be? And so that, I think, for China is a constraint to escalating as well. It's if there's one reassuring thing, actually, Prachi, it's that in terms of the role that the U.S. might play in de-escalating, Trump actually has a really close relationship with Modi. Apparently, he's invested in that, and Modi has definitely invested in that. It's one of these relationships and partnerships where Trump hasn't burned bridges, there's a possibility that with China, that China might be open to a U.S. role. Because it could actually end up improving ties with the U.S. that have been so deteriorated recently. So if there's one moment in the Trump presidency where it might seem that a particular crisis might be actually an opportunity for U.S. diplomacy, this might be it.
I guess that's definitely possible. I think that would be a big shift for India, because although India has definitely worked to improve its relationship with the United States in the last few years, it's also, for the most part, tried to be friends with everybody or to not really take sides. And I think that really relying on the U.S. to intervene to stabilize relations would kind of push it more towards that camp and potentially set India and China against each other, which I don't think I don't think India really wants to be so confrontational. On the other hand, as you said, there are a lot of pressures coming from India domestically, where increasingly the public is turning against China. There was this is just one small data point, but there was an article in TechCrunch recently about how this app that removed Chinese apps from your phone was downloaded like 5 million times and, went viral in India, just an app to remove Chinese apps from a phone. I feel like that's a real signal of where the domestic audience is. So maybe I think Modi is facing some pressure on that side as well. He's in a tough spot right now.
And Freddy, the converse of what I'm saying could also be true in the sense that both China and India have these global ambitions to be global powers, or in India's case, probably a great power. And so they might be a little averse to having the U.S. interject itself as to resolve a conflict. India has always been very prickly about internationalizing Kashmir to outside mediation. And so that could mean that China and India refuse any kind of outside intervention or participation in terms of conflict resolution as well.
Yeah, I think that both India and China, as you said, have their own reasons for resisting either U.S. offers of mediation or from anyone else if this situation gets worse. I think the flip side, hopefully, if this plays out like this sort of shaky status quo that has held for a while, one of the other sort of factors is just because of the geography of the situation and this remote, very high mountain pass. This clash that happened earlier this week was something at like 14,000 feet. It's a very hard place to fight a war, first of all, because of the terrain. But also there's not very much there. It's extremely remote. It's extremely harsh territory, just in terms of the geography. So you have to think also that if India and China both have these grander ambitions and bigger, a bigger picture look at what they are really sort of aiming for, fighting over this little bit of territory that isn't particularly strategic in any way, maybe isn't worth it. That said, there's a reason why these tensions keep coming up and why they haven't ever fully resolved it. So it does go both ways in that sense. But I think that, like all conflicts in the past that have started from a smaller issue and then ballooned into something else, the concern is that the nationalist tendencies or spoilers on one side or another will seek to fan the flames. And I do think that between Chinese state media and what is an increasingly nationalist media in India on top of Modi and his government in power, there are all the elements there to make this look much worse than it is.
It is sort of a pretty blatant illustration of the absurdity often of conflict. We spend a lot of time analyzing and examining the geopolitics of international competition and the competition over resources and influence and also and economic access and things like that. And then all of a sudden we have this risk of a war between two nuclear powers and emerging major powers. And it's over this desolate, inhospitable, remote pass that in and of itself is of no real value. It's not even a strategic pass in the Himalayas by which a major invasion could pass. It's really just a conflict over the symbolism of maintaining national dignity, essentially. And so in that sense, it really does sort of illustrate the absurdity of some of these conflicts. I guess at the same time that when these conflicts or get triggered, and especially when there's that amount of deaths, it's really very hard sometimes to close off the escalation and to resist the forces at play, especially domestically. I can imagine possibly some sort of mutual decision to really reprimand the local commanders so that the national leadership can blame it on the people who are on the ground at the scene. But short of that, it's going to be very tricky, especially since, as for now, both sides are blaming the other for the situation getting out of hand.
Right. As you said, this is in some ways a symbolic zone. That's an interesting way to think about it. And that kind of brings to mind, what I mentioned earlier, that I'm not sure it's worth it for China to pursue conflict in this area if there's not necessarily a gain other than, a gain of further aggravating a country that could be a partner to it, or at least not an enemy. I came across this quote from a foreign minister from the Chinese foreign minister in 1960 that kind of, somebody could say this now. He said, "We do not want to offend India. Our relations with the United States and Japan in the East are tense. It would be stupid if we created a tense situation with India in the West." And, the parties have changed, but China is facing a very tense situation in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in the South China Sea. It seems unwise to open up another front. And yet at the same time, as Freddy said, this conflict has gone on for a long time, and there is a real question of, how long will they be able to sustain friendly relations without making any progress on issues that are important to them? They've essentially been in kind of a stalemate, just being friendly with each other for a long time. So after so many years, maybe something does need to change.
It's a great point in the sense that China faces a pretty challenging local neighborhood for an aspiring global power. When the U.S. after World War II became a global power, it faced no real near threats in its neighborhood, whereas China has India on its border. There's Japan and South Korea nearby. There's the always perpetual potential powder keg in terms of North Korea and potential crises there. And so there's all this, there's so many compelling reasons for China, especially because China by almost all measures is stronger than India in terms of national power, whether it's economy, its military. And so as a stronger power, it could sort of show an indulgence and try to rise above in that sense. But at the same time, there's been this long-standing sense or question, is Asia big enough for the both of them? The two, they're always are often talked about the rising Asian powers and things like that. China's clearly in a different category, but the question is whether China will ever really feel secure with India on its border without in some way establishing a real pecking order with India through this kind of conflict. And so there too, the tensions between the competing trends and the competing motivations in China are obvious. And for India, there's this question of maintaining a range of options, not getting too tied into the U.S. orbit, not getting tied into a perception that it's part of an axis that's trying to contain China. But at the same time, now there's growing anxiety that, maybe we actually will need to join that kind of coalition because we might be next on the list in terms of the kind of illustrations China wants to give about its growing power.
Yeah, I think China arguably has more at risk and more to sort of calculate here because for all of their rise and growing influence, we know that there's a lot that has come with a lot of discomfort among its neighbors, whether it's in Southeast Asia or the South China Sea or farther afield in the region. Even countries that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative or have expanded their economic ties with China. There's also this suspicion about debt trap diplomacy, quote unquote, and what China really wants, and whether these countries will become sort of wards of China through very sort of loans that will tie them to Beijing, and that not to say that the U.S. didn't have its own advantages to press after World War II when it was expanding as a superpower, but there's a different set of concerns and criticisms of China that China is certainly aware of, and I think that if they press a conflict with India, that will just add to that perception. Also, I do think there's the bigger question as well that if she is really going to push this much more aggressive foreign policy, which we're already seeing in Hong Kong, which we might see in Taiwan even, which, is playing out intermittently in the South China Sea. Is China really committed to extending that to its border with India, beyond, the usual status quo of this longstanding border standoff? I think that China has potentially more to lose if they really push it that far.
There's a point where you have to pick your battles, and in terms of historically, Chinese strategy, military strategy, has always been very clear on this need to avoid overextending and avoiding unnecessary conflict when you already have conflict in other zones. So for that reason alone, it would argue for restraint. Prachi, there's always, or over the past 5, 10, 15 years, there's been this discussion about America's relative decline in influence around the world, and the rise of the rest, these emerging powers, this diffusion of power around the world, where we're heading into either a multipolar world or a G0 world where there's anarchy and no major powers. I've always been something of an optimist in the sense that I feel that the reasons for restraint and to avoid conflict exist independently of whether the United States is the global superpower trying to backstop the rules-based order, and that countries have a natural and inherent interest to avoid conflict. So for me, this is kind of a test case in a world and a scenario and a moment where the U.S. might not have leverage and might not have influence and might not be able to play a role. And global institutions like the UN, for instance, won't be able to play a role. Whether the two countries involved can walk back from the brink and just be responsible to avoid conflict on their own. Framed like that, are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to this particular issue, but also other issues, other regions, other regional crises and conflicts that might arise as the international order is shifting and transitioning? Is this something that you think naturally tends toward de-escalation, or are you alarmed about the possibility of increased conflict?
That's a really interesting way to frame this issue. I think that what comes to mind is there's this concept of decision fatigue that I think when the U.S. is more involved globally and more able to be an arbiter in these conflicts, I think its mere presence can deter some conflicts from rising to the point where countries need to make the decision about whether to go to war or not. So, if the U.S. were coming out very strongly to say, we really support India in this situation, it might not be what Modi wants, but then, Modi wouldn't really have to make this decision at all because China probably wouldn't want to enter into a direct confrontation with the United States. So I think as that kind of power recedes, countries will more increasingly need to make these decisions and potentially be more open to pressure from, as we said, from domestic audiences about, defending a sense of nationalism or whatever. But I like the way that you framed it, and I don't want to be overly pessimistic about it. I do think that countries have an incentive to avoid conflict as much as they have an incentive to, appease the masses. So yeah, I wouldn't fall strongly on one side or another, but it's definitely an interesting point.
Freddy, optimist or pessimist in both in this particular case, but also this case as perhaps a precursor of what regional conflicts between middle powers or emerging powers might look like in a global environment where the U.S., the UN, the EU, international institutions have less pull and less influence in terms of conflict resolution.
I think it's there's certainly a case for it, but I do think also, just looking back at history, the fact that this has sort of been the status quo, the shaky status quo between India and China in this particular case, since 1962, shows that even when in a different context, when the U.S. maybe had more legitimacy in brokering international disagreements, or the UN had more influence, that this situation in particular was not resolved, and there's a reason it hasn't been resolved. And so I think that, obviously some of the underlying dynamics might be shifting and tensions may be rising, but for these kinds of intractable conflicts that have been that way for decades, there's a reason they've been that way for decades, I guess, is one way of putting it. Obviously, the hope is that doesn't all of a sudden change. And I still think that with something like this, it doesn't change overnight. And even though we've seen more tension in recent years between China and India, there are still these longer trends to keep in mind.
I don't know if either of you have been up at that kind of altitude. I'd have to do the calculations because it was in meters. I think I was up at around certainly 12,000, maybe 12,500 feet. And just walking about 50 yards took about 3 or 4 stages. Each time I'd think to myself, I'll just stop at that rock over there that normally you just walk over in about 5 or 10 seconds. And it took 5 or 10 minutes to get halfway before I realized I needed a break. So the thought of war breaking out in this remote region at such an altitude is somewhat mind-boggling. I'm going to come out formally on the side of optimism, and hopefully the two sides manage to walk back and de-escalate. I think there's so many reasons to do so, especially now given all the other challenges that they both and the entire world are facing. So I'm going to come down officially and formally on the side of optimism in this particular instance. All right, time to mention some WPR articles for everyone listening. Freddy, which one did you have in mind?
A briefing by Jonathan Gorvit on the still ongoing saga of Brexit, and how maybe you lost sight of the fact that the UK is supposed to reach a deal with the European Union by the end of this year, but because of the coronavirus pandemic and everything else, that looks once again like it is increasingly unlikely. And once again, a no-deal Brexit is possibly on the table. And as bad as that would be for both Ireland and Northern Ireland in particular, it will be even worse in the context of a pandemic.
I've been thinking actually for Boris Johnson that the pandemic makes it easier to pass off a no-deal Brexit, because a lot of the economic damage will have already been done by the pandemic, and it'll be very hard to figure out what's a result of what. So it might end up being a disincentive for him to make concessions and negotiate an actual deal. We'll see, but it's definitely going to be a deja vu all over again at the end of this year. Prachi, which one did you have in mind?
This week's in-depth article called How COVID-19 Could Increase the Risk of War by David Kampf. So Dave explains that, contrary to what you might think, the risk and incidence of war was already rising before COVID-19. Civil wars were increasing in number and attracting more international interference, and the theoretical trends that had maintained peace for so long, democracy, economic prosperity, multilateral cooperation, were all in decline. So now COVID-19 is both exposing and accelerating those trends. He writes, regardless of what happens whenever the pandemic is resolved, it will be tempting to point to the coronavirus as the cause. But the shape of the post-pandemic world was forming long before the virus began to spread. If leaders are smart, they will take seriously the warning signs exposed by this global emergency and work to reverse the drift toward war.
I definitely thought of that article when I saw the news about the escalation on the border this week between China and India. And I'll flag a briefing co-authored by Alice Friend and Daniel E. White on civil-military relations in the U.S. Alice and Daniel discussed two trends that the current protests over racism and police brutality against Black Americans are highlighting and exacerbating: the increasing politicization of the U.S. military, particularly among retired officers, and the long-standing unresolved issues of racism in the military. Alice and Daniel explain that racial and political identities in the military tend to overlap, with the overwhelmingly white officer corps largely identifying with the Republican Party. Both these trends predate the Trump administration, but as a result of President Donald Trump's efforts to militarize the response to the current anti-racism protests, Alice and Daniel write, quote, these trends openly collided, raising questions about whether and how the military will be involved in domestic political contests and debates in the years to come, unquote. All right, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddy, why don't you kick things off?
All right, this is which country this is about. We hope this can be resolved quickly. In the very short term, we see there might be logistical challenges to getting seafood in.
I don't know.
Yeah, I have no idea. It sounds like a good one, though.
It's about China and a backlash against salmon, in particular, imported salmon, which the latest spike in coronavirus cases in Beijing was falsely attributed to a fish market, in particular, a salmon that is imported to Japanese restaurants and other places. That turned out not to be the case, but there's an interesting article in the New York Times about the backlash against salmon and sort of one element of looking for someone else to blame among many people in China right now as the virus has returned.
Caused multi-million dollars worth of damage to the Norwegian salmon export industry.
Exactly. The quote was actually from a Norwegian trade group.
Right on. Prachi, what do you got?
So this is a very vague quote. Again, I'm sorry, but I know you've both read about this, so I had to make it a little bit hard. All right. You can give me who's saying it or who it's about. So here's the quote. Do you want to do something historic?
Oh, I think I want to say it's, is it the Polish president to Donald Trump about moving U.S. troops that are being withdrawn from Germany to Poland?
No. Freddy, do you have a guess?
No, I don't want to say it, but I feel like it has something to do with John Bolton and his book.
Yeah, exactly. So this was something that Trump said to John Bolton, his former national security advisor, whose book leaked this week, or sections of it anyway. And this was when they were discussing how Trump wanted to threaten U.S. allies that he would withdraw from NATO if they didn't increase their defense spending by January. So he said, do you want to do something historic?
I was close. I was just a few years off. I almost just gave a blanket response before we started, say that John Bolton is my guess for both of your who said that. But all right, here goes mine. I'm going to blank out the country. And it's a country and a country's leader. So either one of those that it's about will be a correct answer. Here you go. It's really the biggest embarrassment he will suffer in his prime ministership in blank, particularly on international affairs.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank too.
It's Shuvaloy Majumdar commenting on Canada's failed bid to win a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council. In all fairness, Majumdar was a foreign policy advisor to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's predecessor, Stephen Harper. A little more sympathetic assessment was given in this same Time magazine article by Richard Gowan, a former WPR columnist and International Crisis Group's top UN watcher. Richard said, quote, Canada was always coming from behind in this race after starting late. To get over 100 votes despite this handicap is a pretty impressive feat. But since it's about Justin Trudeau, I'm going to take the more unsympathetic quote. All right, great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, Prachi.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.
you.